What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. Brandon Lee was born and raised in San Francisco, but he was almost assassinated when he was in Ifugao in the Philippines in 2019, where he was working as a journalist observing the terror of the then Duterte regime in the Philippines. It's terror that continues under Bongbong Marcos, and the government, backed and funded, encouraged by the US, is sending in death squads to assassinate people who are working with indigenous people in the area and working with environmentalists in the area. Trigger warning, because we do talk about the assassination attempt. He's also going to discuss the US disinformation campaign in the Philippines and why the Bay goes so hard for the Filipino liberation movement. Thank you to Kumi for the connection. I also want to thank Brandy for helping us out at patreon.com/sadfrancisco. At Patreon, you can leave us a monetary tip if you like the work we do so that we can focus more of our time on creating content like this podcast. You can find all of our past episodes there as well. And if you don't have the cash right now, help us out by spreading the word about the podcast. Share it on social media, follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, or YouTube, and leave us reviews. Love getting the positive affirmation from you all. Here with Brandon Lee. Super stoked that it worked out. Finally, you are just back from DC. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
What were you doing out there?
I was on a speaking tour. It's called The Fight Like Brandon Lee, a speaking tour for Just Peace. It's been 5 years since the attempted assassination on my life.
So we're going to get into that a bit. First off, wanted to ask you a little bit about your background in the Bay. You are from San Francisco. I was wondering if you can remember like the moment or place that you were first politicized.
Yeah, so 23 years ago, a way back, the US declared its war on Afghanistan. And then subsequently, the following year, the war on Iraq. And I remember just seeing on TV all the women and children screaming and saying that this isn't right. Our US tax dollars shouldn't be used on this, especially on the doctrine of shock and awe, which is meaning bombings of civilian population. And I took to the streets. One of my professors who was part of the KDP, that's the Katipunan Demokratikong ng Pilipinas, they sent me to go to the rally as one of the projects. And I went there with open eyes, learning why are people on the streets like myself. We all didn't want this war. And I found the Buy in USA contingent, which was with the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition Against War. And they were wearing like red shirts. It's a sea of red shirts. The slogan, serve the people, among others. And that's something I still believe in today. And they were just chanting, sexy chants. So I was drawn to that.
Yeah, that huge protest. I wish that I had been here for it. It was, as far as I understand, one of the most epic protests ever, where people were coming out against the war in Iraq that we know was a total flop in every way, killed over 1 million people. At the same time, did spark a lot of people's interest in cutting down the US war machine and anti-imperialism. I imagine it was super inspiring. Up until then, you had lived in the Bay and you ended up working as a journalist in the Philippines. Was this in your early 20s?
Actually, during the time I moved to the Philippines was in 2010.
Gotcha.
They had the need for someone to report on their issues on the ground. I have no background in journalism. I just wrote it like I saw it. And when I interviewed the people about their issues, like it just came naturally just to tell it all. Yeah, so I was already in my late 20s.
Gotcha. So you were there in the Philippines for about how long? And could you describe the area that you were reporting on?
I was there from 2010 until October 2019, so pretty much 9 years. The area that I lived with, a lot of the Ifugao indigenous peoples lived in the province of Ifugao. They were protecting their natural resources like their rivers, which is part of their life. There were a lot of dam companies coming in, trying to profit off the renewable energies and just giving a drop in the bucket to the people, which is like less than a penny per megawatt generated. When the people signed those memoranda of agreement with the company and they were taught what their indigenous people's rights were, that's when they retracted their MOA, or the memorandum of agreement. And that's when the company got up in arms and the military came in trying to quell any dissent. When we organized the people, the military started to threaten, harass, intimidate them, put them under surveillance, ask many of the communities to surrender as communist rebels, which they weren't, and they accused the Ifugao peasant movement, which is the organization I worked with, as being a communist terrorist organization recruiting the New People's Army. And they killed my friend, William Bugatti, who was the human rights officer with the Ifugao peasant movement in 2014. All of us, myself included, received a death threat with the California idiom, gray May, June gloom, no sky July, with the Ifugao burial blanket for the dead, and addressed to myself on my envelope, said my name, my Ifugao address / NorCal. Now, not that many people outside of the California or the US knows what NorCal is. That's how I know the military did their due diligence and surveillance. From 2015 onward to 2019, we all kept receiving threats with the military visiting our homes and office, trying to get us to surrender as New People's Army. For me in particular, they asked how much money was I making, what my role is in the Ifugao peasant movement, if I can teach the 54th Infantry Battalion human rights, which they have all the budget in the world to learn that themselves. Yeah, and then a week before I was shot, they came to visit me in my home and office and asked to partner with the Ifugao peasant movement. I gave them two names, William Bugatti and Ricardo Mayumi, both who were killed by suspected state agents, on why we don't want to partner with the military.
Some very creepy, twisted things that went down. I mean, when you first, started receiving these threats, what was your reaction? What was going through your mind?
Of course, myself included, but all of us were scared. We don't know what will happen, especially after our friend and colleague William was killed. We decided to always buddy up. We don't go anywhere without someone. But today, even if you go with a buddy, your buddy and yourself are more than likely to be abducted by the state, as in the case of Dexter Capuyan and Bazu de Jesus, or Jack and Echo, or Jonella and Jed. They're abducting activists in pairs today. In the past, we had that as a protocol to secure each other, and always to text or call your relatives and your organization where you're going when you arrive, just to let them know that you're safe.
Such intense repression that it's necessary to have these extra precautions in place. The area that you're talking about in the Philippines, would you say it's roughly where San Francisco is to LA to Manila, which is the largest city in the Philippines?
Roughly 8 hours by bus. which is like the same can be said with in traffic going to LA. But actually, the distance is much shorter. There's just a lot of traffic in the Philippines.
Gotcha. So all of this is happening in like a backdrop of like, not being that far from the city that a lot of people will fly through as they're traveling in Southeast Asia. So all of this creepy shit, for lack of a better term, is going on. And then, as you mentioned, some of your friends, comrades are actually killed. And then what happened on August 6th in 2019?
So since the foreign military came to visit me in the office, after that encounter, I stopped walking to the office. I stopped walking to the school where my daughter and niece goes to. Everywhere I go, I take the tricycle, which is the mode of transportation there. I just pretty much stopped going to the office altogether, thinking that they might come and visit me there. So 1 week later, it's August 6th. I bring my daughter and niece home. I heat up leftovers for my daughter, clear out the bones. I go outside. It's 5:45 at night. I'm feeding the leftover chicken bones with rice to the dogs. I call the dogs. They're not coming. And then I hear thunder. And then I collapse to the ground. I try to talk. Not much sound is coming out of my mouth. I hear ringing in my ears. And the yaya, the caretaker of my youngest niece, comes out screaming, and there's a pool of blood. I ask her to get my brother-in-law downstairs. She goes down. He gets our neighbor, the cousin, to come, and my brother-in-law calls my wife, calls the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance to let them know what happened to myself. I get brought to the nearby provincial hospital. They can't do anything for me because they're not specialized in neurosurgery. So they just bandage me up, send me on an ambulance to the regional hospital, which is an hour away. The regional hospital in Bayombong, which they also don't have a neurosurgeon. So they said I have to take an ambulance to Baguio, which is another 5 hours away. But there's no nurse willing to accompany us, so we had to wait for our family member, who's a nurse, to actually join us, which took another hour. And when he finally came, we were able to go on an ambulance through the Cordillera Mountains, which has low signal for cell reception. And sometime through it, the ambulance breaks down, or it runs out of gas, and my oxygen actually, it runs out of oxygen. And then my wife and members of the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance were able to meet us, and at the same time, another ambulance comes to bring us to Baguio, where the anesthesiast asks what happened to myself. And I tell them that it was the military that shot me. And they tried to extract the bullets from my body. And as they tried to extract one, I get a cardiac arrest, followed by 7 more cardiac arrests. And I thought it was over at that time, but I lived, and I had a tracheostomy where they puncture under my neck so I can breathe. But because of the tracheostomy, I wasn't able to talk until maybe my final week in the Philippines in mid-October, which was almost 2 months after I was shot, that I wasn't able to talk.
Damn. Thank you for telling the story that I'm sure every time you have to go back to that day, it has to be, traumatic. Thank you for taking us through it again. You did have family, fortunately, that were in the Philippines at the time. Could you talk about how it happened that you were able to come back? Meanwhile, people out here were organizing around your case throughout this time.
So it took a mass movement to keep me safe in the Philippines and even here in the US, where people organized to fundraise for my medical evacuation, which took something around $180,000 just to be able to fly me back safely. The people here in the US were able to organize a delegation that included a faith delegation to come and visit me. And then San Francisco supervisor Matt Haney also came, and he spoke out at San Francisco City Hall that the Philippine military, what they did to me and what they're doing in the Philippines, which is a lot of state-sponsored violence. He and Supervisor Gordon Marr was able to co-write a resolution that condemned the attempted extrajudicial killing of myself and to push forward for independent investigation, which the police has not really identified any suspects, even though I had documented violations numerous times with the Philippine police. The Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines also archived my case, saying there's a lack of evidence, even though everyone they subpoena never showed up. But they did identify that there was a violation to my right to life, that the Philippine military and police should refrain from red tagging, which is like McCarthyist red baiting, or calling people communists without any factual basis, and making civilians a target to be neutralized by the Philippine state.
What is the penalty for being out as communist in the Philippines?
So actually, in the mid-90s, being a communist is already legalized during the President Ramos time. But however, since Duterte had already designated communists as terrorists, including the New People's Army, anyone who's tagged as a communist can be neutralized permanently or killed. Their rights are disregarded. But today there are activists who are being designated that, but they're fighting back in the court, fighting the terrorist designation, fighting the fact that their bank accounts and their organizational accounts are also frozen, which causes a lot of harm to the individual because, of course, they become overcome by all these emotions about being targeted and under surveillance.
So again, very intense repression. You talked about how there initially was some action from, or at least some words from politicians here in the United States around your case. Unfortunately, a lot of politicians, continue to kiss the ass of Duterte in the US, and appreciated your piece in The Nation that we will link to in the show notes about APEC, which was a big international conference that happens every couple of years. And last time around in 2023 happened in October in San Francisco. Maybe you could talk about what involvement does the US have in putting a stamp of approval or even sending money to the Duterte regime?
Yeah, so my case is just one of thousands. In fact, Duterte's war on the poor is seen as very devastating. More than 30,000 suspected drug dealers and pushers were killed under Duterte. But a lot of the times, the drugs were planted after the fact that they were killed. The U.S. has supplied a lot of ammunition and guns to the Philippine military as well as the police. The U.S. provides military training, which teaches the military on how to conduct surveillance and counterinsurgency so that they can protect their own investment. And after the Philippines is able to eradicate any of what the U.S. and the Philippines calls communist terrorists, then the U.S. wants the Philippines to concentrate on its external threats, such as China. So actually, the U.S. has orchestrated a lot of the counterinsurgency that's happening in the Philippines. And that counterinsurgency blurs the line and definition between what is considered civilian and what is considered armed combatant, which makes any activist in danger. And there's plenty of activists killed under former President Duterte. I think the number ranges already past 440. And under President Marcos, it's no different. Actually, the bombings and abductions have increased over the time of President Duterte.
It's extremely dark to hear how the US has been so involved in promoting terror against people in the Philippines. You know, some of the darker news that I heard about over the past year was the military, the US military. In June, Reuters came out with this report about how the US was involved in Philippines and a few other countries spreading misinformation about the COVID vaccine supplied by China and saying that it was dangerous or ineffective. As a result, we can expect that a lot of people became anti-vax and didn't want to get the vaccine. And a lot of people died as a result of the misinformation. Wondering, unfortunately, I feel like that news story was so flash in the pan, but I was wondering if you could say like what your response to that coming out, that like bombshell coming out was.
Yeah, actually, I don't think it's misinformation, because misinformation is like if you accidentally give wrong information. It's more disinformation where you maliciously spread
Thanks for
wrong
the correction.
information. And yeah, it's a CIA operation to counter pretty much China's credibility in the Philippines, to turn what Duterte has been doing in the Philippines, which is making more business deals with China rather than the US. So it's to sow distrust among the ordinary people against China. And actually, you're right. It caused a lot of pain, harm, death, and a lot of mistrust toward China. Instead of helping the people, the US should have been actually giving out vaccines for free, like China was.
If the point, was to turn people, against China towards the US, I mean, it's really, I don't like to use the word criminal because it means so many things to different people, but I just, it's hard to know how to describe that. And the military came out and said that they stood by it and that this is the sort of this disinformation campaign, as you mentioned, is kosher, I guess, is the kind of thing that we may expect more from the military, and we are funding that. So some pretty dark stuff, but I do get some hope out of the fact that the Filipino left in the Bay Area, to me, as somebody who is Japanese American and is starting to connect with other people on the left who are Japanese American amongst Asian American movements, that the Filipinos that I know do it better here in the Bay than any of the rest of us. What do you think makes the left fairly strong amongst Filipinos here in the Bay?
Well, I think it goes back to how strong their organizations are in the Philippines, how well seasoned their lessons are from the time of Marcos all the way up to present day today. A lot of anti-Marcos organizers actually came to the US to establish overseas chapters. And we have Bayan in the Philippines, which is the new patriotic alliance of national democratic organizations. And then in the US, there's the overseas chapter of Bayan USA. And they have spread their messages, their organizing methods, and allowing Filipino Americans to go back home to learn from their people on the streets, in the farms, in the workplace, in the indigenous communities, women organizations, the fisher folk areas. And yeah, they're able to explain concretely what their problems are and what the solutions are. And I think by taking those concepts and bringing it back to the US, the people are able to amplify the demands of the Filipino compatriots back in the Philippines. And their solidarity work is going well as expected. They relate to other national liberation struggles like in Palestine, El Salvador, and Myanmar, and has worked with the Japanese community, Korean community, with the trilateral agreement that the US made with Japan and the Philippines.
Yeah, no, so many, like, another thing that I appreciate about this movement is like the acknowledgement of how interconnected all the struggles are. It's like so plain. It is not hard to see because people in the movement that I met really make it front and center. Like, as you said, with Palestine, I mean, you said that you were politicized originally around Iraq. We see like so many other movements where like APEC, RIMPAC is another issue that we've done an episode on, which is these military exercises that the US sort of sponsors with a bunch of Pacific Rim countries to sort of like show off their military might. In all of these different struggles, the Filipino left in the US is kind of at the front. Thank you so much for kind of like sharing your story, and definitely hope that people can sort of like get involved with some of the work. Is there a place that we can send them to?
Yes. So if you're in the Bay Area, you're Filipino and want to help out with the national democratic struggle, join a Buy In USA organization. There's the League of Filipino Students at UC Berkeley, at San Francisco State University. Then there's Anak Bayan chapters in City College of San Francisco and Daly City. And then there's Gabriela chapters in both Oakland and in the Excelsior. And then if you're not Filipino and you just want to support as a solidarity ally, there's San Francisco Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. That's the organization I'm part of. And then there's Oakland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines.
Yeah, and actually, yeah, that's how I got hooked up with you, was through the someone at the Oakland program at Kumi. Shout out to Kumi. Thanks for hooking us up. And then, also, since you're from the Bay and I know we're talking on Zoom, but we are both in San Francisco at the moment. Yeah, just wondering if you would let the people know favorite spot to be in San Francisco or the Bay.
Yeah, there's a lot of great spots. There's a lot of ethnic enclaves here. The Mission has a lot of great food spots. If you love ice cream, there's Mitchell's. If you like Filipino food culture, go to the South Market area. There's Japantown, there's Chinatown. There's a whole bunch of great places here in San Francisco. If you want a place just to stroll around in nature, there's Golden Gate Park.
Hard to argue with all of those recommendations, which are, blocks away from each other. Special place that we live in, I think. And so happy that I keep saying this, keeps ending up on like every episode, but doing this podcast has allowed me to meet other people who I have respected from afar or not so far, as we're in the same city. But just to know that, yeah, other people out there in the Bay are, like doing this kind of work in solidarity with struggles all over the world. One of the things that makes the Bay, I think, really a place that I want to be. So yeah, thank you so much, Brandon. People should check out Bayan, and we'll link to some of Brandon's journalistic pieces in the show notes. Thank you so much, Brandon. Hope to have you back again.
Thank you, Toshio.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/SadFrancisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.